1 billion tires are discarded every year, yet a small West African country is attempting to turn that waste into motorcycle brake pads, one of the most unforgiving safety components on the road. What initially sounds like an elegant recycling solution quickly becomes something far more dangerous. Because brakes are not judged by intention, but by consistency, heat, and trust under pressure. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, this project is presented as a symbol of self-reliance and industrial sovereignty, but symbols collapse instantly when safety is questioned. And what happens next will determine whether this becomes a breakthrough or a warning no one forgets. You are about to hear an explanation that goes beyond the surface narrative and into the mechanics that actually decide whether this kind of project survives or collapses. In the next few minutes, you will gain a clear framework to judge safety, credibility, and risk in locally produced industrial parts, not from slogans, but from how trust is built or lost in real markets. This is not content for casual listening. If you stop here, it is easy to reduce the story to an inspiring recycling headline or dismiss it as another political gesture wrapped in green language. Staying means avoiding two common mistakes: confusing intention with performance and mistaking early enthusiasm for long-term viability. Because once safety parts enter daily use, the rules change fast. Rumors move quicker than lab reports. One failure outweighs 100 successes. And when public trust breaks, it does not return gradually. It disappears at once. Understanding this difference matters because the consequences extend far beyond one factory or one product. They shape jobs, mobility, supply chains, and whether self-reliance becomes real practice or empty messaging. What is already becoming clear is that this story is not about recycling at all, and that realization changes how everything else should be read. In a context where motorcycle brakes are daily survival tools, even a small inconsistency can outweigh the most convincing political narrative. One detail anchors that concern. Roughly 1 billion tires are discarded globally each year, but none of that volume automatically translates into usable brake material without heavy industrial control. That single number matters because it highlights scale without guaranteeing suitability, and it exposes the gap between abundance and reliability. The situation begins with a visible problem that no one can ignore. Worn-out tires accumulate behind repair shops, along roadsides, and in informal dumps, becoming both an environmental burden and a symbol of economic leakage. Import dependence adds pressure, as replacement brake pads arrive late, fluctuate in price, and sometimes disappear entirely during supply disruptions. This combination creates an opening where almost any local alternative looks attractive at first glance. The escalation comes when that alternative touches safety. There are components judged in seconds under heat, dust, rain, and repetition. Riders do not measure them by origin or ideology, but by whether the lever feels the same at the end of the day as it did in the morning. Because trust in safety products is binary. It exists fully or it collapses completely. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the proposal is framed as industrial self-reliance rather than environmental charity. The promise is local jobs, reduced imports, and stronger economic autonomy. Yet that framing also raises the stakes. When a project is linked to national direction, its failure is not read as technical error, but as proof that the broader vision was flawed. The first people affected are not policymakers or factory managers. They are mechanics whose reputations depend on every part they install, and riders whose income depends on predictable mobility. And once it hardens, it spreads. That is why the background matters. This is not a question of whether recycling is possible. It is a question of whether discipline can outrun doubt. But to help interpret what is unfolding before judgments harden, that guide is not a heroic figure, but a practical lens through which consequences become visible early. In this case, the guide is the mechanic, a role that quietly shapes outcomes long before policymakers react. A mechanic stands between the factory and the street, between intention and consequence. When a new brake pad appears, the mechanic does not ask where it was made or what message it represents. The mechanic asks whether installing it will protect or damage. A reputation built over years, one wrong recommendation can erase trust faster than any advertising campaign can build it. Early reactions reveal how quickly stakes rise. A locally produced pad that fits well, beds correctly, and feels consistent creates cautious optimism. Riders appreciate availability and price stability. For a brief moment, the narrative seems to confirm itself. Waste becomes input, jobs appear. Imports lose leverage. But this is not enough to sustain belief. Mechanics also notice what most headlines ignore: variation. One batch feels slightly different from another. Dust behavior changes. Heat response is not identical across days. None of this is catastrophic on its own. Yet each inconsistency adds friction to confidence. And in safety markets, friction accumulates silently until it snaps. A second confirmation often arrives from a different angle. Riders begin comparing notes informally at repair stands or fuel stops. Their language is simple and blunt. The brakes felt fine yesterday. Today, they felt off. That uncertainty spreads faster than technical explanations because it is rooted in lived experience, not theory. This is where the story crosses a threshold. Once multiple independent users describe uncertainty, even without failure, the project is no longer judged as innovative. It is judged as risky. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the initiative is meant to demonstrate control and capability. Yet these early signals show that control is not claimed through announcements, it is earned through repetition without surprise. From here on, the question is no longer whether the idea is bold, but whether the system behind it can absorb doubt before doubt defines it. Then accelerates faster than most observers expect. What starts as an industrial announcement shifts into a lived timeline where reactions compound and control is tested minute by minute. The trigger is simple and visible. Tire piles are collected. Machines start running. The first batches of brake pads reach local garages. Prices are lower. For riders used to shortages, that alone feels like relief. Early installations go smoothly. No headlines, momentum builds. Then the pace quickens. Demand rises within weeks, not months. Mechanics reorder. Riders talk. A product that solves a daily frustration spreads without marketing. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the narrative tightens around self-reliance and local capacity, and that framing amplifies attention. Collection speeds up, processing stretches, distribution widens. Pressure follows. Feedstock varies as collectors rush to meet demand. Old tires arrive mixed, contaminated, inconsistent. Sorting slows production, so shortcuts are tempting. Output remains steady, but uniformity quietly drifts. At the street level, nothing fails outright. One rider notices softer bite after repeated stops. Another mentions a change in response on hot afternoons. These are not defects yet. The climb turns into a peak. Imitation appears as soon as popularity is obvious. Packaging looks familiar. Some pads are genuine. Others are copies. Some are blended, lots moving through informal channels. The market cannot easily tell the difference. And most buyers do not try. They install what is available. This is where escalation becomes dangerous, because every experience now feeds the same reputation. Aftershocks spread unevenly. A mechanic pulls one questionable batch to protect a shot name. Another waits, hoping complaints do not return. Riders compare notes. A single alarming story circulates, stripped of nuance. It does not say which pad failed or why. It simply warns others. In safety markets, that is enough. The system reacts. Slowing production would protect quality but strain availability. Pushing volume would stabilize prices but magnify exposure if variation persists. It looks like punishment, not protection. Each day adds installations that will be judged under heat, dust, rain, and repetition. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the project is no longer evaluated as a pilot. It is read as a statement that raises the cost of hesitation and the cost of error at the same time. Officials face a where both paths carry risk, move too slowly and lose momentum. The aftershock phase settles into a tense equilibrium. Two narratives compete in parallel. One describes affordable, available parts that keep people moving. The other warns of inconsistency and lookalikes. Neither wins immediately. The market waits for proof, not promises. What matters next is not a press conference or a factory tour. It is what happens when the next hot afternoon arrives and a rider squeezes the lever again, expecting the same response as yesterday. Before numbers are introduced, the frame has to shift from narrative to measurement. Because this is where confidence either solidifies or unravels. This is the point where intentions stop mattering and repeatable outcomes take over. What follows is not about proving success, but about weighing scale, speed, and human exposure at the same time. Start with scope. Motorcycles are not a niche mode of transport in Burkina Faso. They are the backbone of daily mobility for work, delivery, and commuting. The majority of short-distance movement relies on two wheels, which means brake pads are not occasional purchases. They are high-turnover safety consumables. Replacement cycles shorten. That sounds positive, but it also multiplies exposure. A small inconsistency does not affect dozens of riders. It affects thousands, then tens of thousands, within weeks. Now consider speed. Import-based brake pads arrive in uneven waves, tied to shipping schedules, currency pressure, and border delays. Local production compresses that timeline dramatically. Pads move from factory to garage in days, not months. This acceleration is the first quantitative shift. Faster turnover means more frequent installation, more heat cycles, and more real-world testing per unit of time. Any variation that would have taken a year to surface under slow imports can appear in a single month under local supply. The second measurable dimension is variability. Tire waste is not a uniform input. Different brands, ages, and usage histories produce rubber with different properties. Without strict sorting, batch-to-batch composition changes. In friction materials, even small changes alter heat response and wear behavior. The measurable outcome is not catastrophic failure, but spread. Some pads perform within expected friction ranges, others drift. That spread is what riders feel as unpredictability, even if average performance appears acceptable on paper. The third anchor is human impact. Motorcycle braking is repetitive and unforgiving. In dense traffic, a rider may brake dozens of times per hour. Heat builds, dust coats components, rain interrupts schooling patterns. Consistency matters more than peak performance. A pad that stops well once but behaves differently after repeated use creates cognitive stress. Riders adjust subconsciously, braking earlier, squeezing harder, or riding more cautiously. That adjustment has an economic cost. Slower trips mean fewer deliveries. Fewer jobs completed, less income per day. There is also a trust multiplier at work. Mechanics see returns before officials see reports. If even a small percentage of customers come back complaining about field changes, that data point carries more weight than lab numbers. A mechanic does not calculate percentages. Install again or remove from stock. Each removal is a silent vote, and those votes accumulate faster than formal reviews. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the project's promise is tied to sovereignty and reduced dependence. Quantitatively, that promise only holds if three curves align. Availability rises, variability narrows, and complaints stay near zero. If availability rises faster than variability narrows, the curve bends against trust. At that point, the numbers that matter are no longer production totals or job counts. Repeat installations and how quickly doubt spreads through rider networks. This is why the evidence phase does not end with output figures. How often pads are replaced on time, how often mechanics reorder without hesitation, how rarely riders mention uncertainty, or whether speed amplifies weakness before corrections can catch up. It would be incomplete to move forward without addressing the strongest objections because they are not careless or uninformed. Capability and precedent, and they deserve to be stated clearly before being tested. The first objection argues that turning tire waste into brake pads is fundamentally unsafe. No matter how well-intentioned the process appears, tires are designed to flex, absorb shock, and endure abrasion, not to manage control friction under repeated heat cycles. From this view, any attempt to reuse tire material introduces uncontrollable variables into a component where predictability is everything. Critics argue that long-term consistency is unlikely, and that a single failure would justify abandoning the entire concept rather than refining it. That concern is valid, but it rests on an assumption that tire waste is being used directly as a finished friction surface. In practice, serious manufacturing does not treat waste as destiny. It treats it as input. The technical question is not whether rubber can become a brake pad, but whether recycled material can be processed, stabilized, and used as a controlled ingredient inside a friction formulation that is engineered around performance first. Limited and tested at the batch level, the risk shifts from inherent impossibility to quality-controlled discipline. The second objection focuses on capacity and governance. Even if the chemistry can be managed, skeptics argue that enforcing standards, preventing counterfeits, and maintaining traceability requires institutional strength that is difficult to sustain. Markets flood quickly, gray channels adapt faster than regulators, and once look-like products circulate, public trust collapses regardless of where the fault originated. From this angle, the danger is not technical failure, but reputational contagion. That risk is real, and it explains why enforcement must target systems rather than symbols. Counterfeits thrive on confusion, not on volume. The cheapest option wins, but when batch identification, trusted distribution, and clear exclusion rules are visible at the street level, the incentive structure flips. Mechanics stop gambling their names, riders stop guessing. The market begins to separate certified products from noise. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the ambition is read politically, which raises the cost of error, yet the same visibility also raises the cost of neglecting discipline. The debate then is not whether objections exist, but whether they define an absolute limit or a conditional challenge. When both sides are placed honestly on the table, the picture becomes clear. The idea fails if slogans outrun systems. It survives only if control moves faster than out. Everything changes when trust becomes visible. The midpoint of this story is not a failure or a success announcement, but a quiet shift in how the project is understood. What initially looked like a recycling experiment reveals itself as a test of industrial discipline. At this stage, the decisive factor is no longer material science alone, but whether the system can prove, in real time, that it deserves confidence. The reveal is simple but disruptive. The factory is only half the project. Once batch identification, routine testing, and controlled distribution are treated as core infrastructure rather than add-ons, the entire narrative changes. The question stops being where the pad came from and becomes whether it can be verified instantly. That single change alters behavior on the street more than any speech or press release. This is where Ibrahim Traoré's framing meets reality. Self-reliance stops being a slogan and becomes a method. Pads without identification are no longer debated, they are excluded. Mechanics gain a rule they can enforce without argument. Riders gain a signal they can recognize without expertise. Doubt does not disappear, but it slows because it now has something concrete to test against. The impact is immediate. Counterfeits lose their main advantage, which is ambiguity. Genuine products no longer have to compete on price alone. They compete on certainty. That does not guarantee success, but it changes the direction of risk. From here on, the story is no longer about whether recycled brake pads are inspiring. It is about whether systems can stay boring, repeatable, and strict under pressure. Everything that follows depends on that answer. The consequences move quickly from theory into daily life, and this is where the story becomes tangible. Effects appear across multiple layers at the same time, each reacting differently, but feeding into the same outcome. At the state level, pressure concentrates around credibility. When a safety-critical product is linked to national direction, every outcome reflects on governance. Clear standards and visible enforcement reduce the need for constant public defense. Officials spend less time responding to rumors and more time maintaining oversight. When uncertainty drops, decision-making stabilizes. Under Ibrahim Traoré, that stability matters. Because industrial self-reliance is judged not by intention, but by whether institutions can protect citizens from avoidable risk. A verified system lowers political exposure by narrowing the space where doubt can grow. For businesses, the impact is immediate and practical. Authorized garages benefit first. When mechanics know exactly which batches they are installing, return rates fall and disputes shrink. Inventory becomes predictable. Price competition shifts away from who is cheapest today toward who is reliable tomorrow. Manufacturers upstream gain clearer demand signals, which allows production planning to slow down just enough to protect consistency without collapsing supply. Informal sellers feel the opposite effect. As verification becomes easier than guessing, gray market advantage erodes. The most significant shift appears at the level of ordinary riders. Predictable braking changes behavior in subtle but powerful ways. When pads are affordable and trusted, riders replace them earlier instead of pushing them to failure. That reduces stress in traffic and lowers accident risk that rarely makes headlines but shapes daily anxiety. Income stabilizes as fewer workdays are lost to mechanical uncertainty. Confidence replaces caution, not because riders feel brave, but because systems stop surprising them. Beyond national borders, the ripple effect spreads through the region. Neighboring markets watch closely, not for speeches but for patterns. If consistency holds, local production becomes a reference point rather than an exception. Supply chains shorten, dependence on volatile imports ceases. If it fails, the lesson travels just as fast, reinforcing skepticism towards similar initiatives elsewhere. Regional perception does not wait for formal reports. It responds to lived outcomes. The combined effect is cumulative. State credibility supports business confidence. Business confidence supports mechanic behavior. Mechanic behavior shapes rider trust. Break any link, and the chain weakens. Strengthen all of them, and the system begins to reinforce itself. What stands out is that none of these outcomes depend on perfect performance. They depend on predictability. A pad that behaves the same today as yesterday earns more trust than one that promises excellence without proof. But risk reductions spread across society. At this stage, no one is asking whether the idea sounds good. They are watching whether everyday experience confirms it. And once experience settles, narratives follow, not the other way round. The future branches into three plausible paths, each shaped less by intention than by how consistently discipline is applied when pressure rises. In the base scenario, the most likely outcome. The system holds together but remains under strain. Standards are enforced unevenly. Certified pads dominate formal garages, while informal channels continue to circulate mixed quality products at the margins. Availability stays better than imports, but not perfectly stable. Riders experience mostly predictable braking, with occasional doubts that never fully disappear. The project neither collapses nor transforms the market. It becomes a functional compromise, delivering partial self-reliance without fully escaping suspicion. But it is fragile and requires constant attention to prevent backsliding. In the optimistic scenario, discipline compounds. Batch identification becomes routine rather than exceptional. Enforcement shifts upstream, cutting off counterfeit supply before it reaches mechanics. Authorized garages gain pricing and supply advantages that make compliance profitable, not burdensome. Riders begin to recognize verified pads instinctively, replacing them earlier and more consistently. Over time, complaint rates drop to near zero. Not because failures vanish but because variation narrows. Confidence grows quietly. The project becomes a reference point rather than a debate. Local production reduces import exposure meaningfully, and the model attracts cautious replication in neighboring markets. Success here is not loud, repeatable, and resilient. The worst-case scenario emerges if speed outruns control. Demand surges faster than sorting and testing capacity. Variability widens, counterfeits flood the gap. One high-visibility scare, whether real or mislabeled, ignites widespread distrust. Mechanics quietly pull stock to protect their reputations. Riders delay maintenance or revert to expensive imports, focusing on messaging instead of correction. At that point, volume amplifies damage. Every additional unit installed increases the chance of another negative story. Trust collapses, and recovery becomes unlikely because safety markets do not grant second chances easily. These scenarios do not depend on ideology or ambition. When small problems are detected early and corrected publicly, confidence compounds. Or hidden, doubt spreads faster than fixes can catch up. The strategic lesson is not to predict which path will occur, but to prepare for all three at once. That means building capacity to slow down when needed, respond transparently when questioned, and enforce rules even when enforcement is unpopular. The future will be decided less by the first months of enthusiasm than by the first moments of stress. What matters most is not choosing optimism or caution, but recognizing that outcomes follow behavior. Is difficult to reverse. After following the arc of the system and its possible futures, the most important question becomes personal. Beyond policy debates and industrial design, for those who actively track these developments, the takeaway is leverage through understanding. Seeing how trust is built at the level of standards, distribution and enforcement provides an advantage. It allows you to separate early noise from meaningful signals and to recognize whether discipline is tightening or slipping. The risk for this group is overconfidence. Fast-moving systems can change direction quickly, so staying informed matters more than reaching a conclusion too early. For those affected indirectly, the impact is quieter but real. Supply chains influence prices, availability, and daily reliability even when you are not installing parts yourself. When safety consumables become predictable, costs stabilize and planning becomes easier. When uncertainty returns, it shows up as delays, higher prices, and stress that seems disconnected from its source. Preparing here is less about action and more about expectation. Knowing why volatility appears helps you respond calmly instead of being surprised. For those who feel distant from the issue, it may seem irrelevant until it suddenly is not. Safety markets rarely announce their importance in advance. They reveal it when something fails or becomes scarce. Ignoring how trust is managed means relying on luck rather than understanding. Even minimal awareness changes that balance. You do not need to follow every detail, but recognizing the difference between verified systems and unchecked shortcuts reduces vulnerability. Across all three groups, the common thread is agency. None of this requires technical expertise or political alignment. It requires attention to patterns. Are rules applied consistently? Are corrections visible? Are incentives aligned with safety rather than speed? Understanding these questions does not force a position, and readiness is what prevents people from being caught off guard when systems shift. Solutions only matter if they move from principle to execution, because slogans cannot stabilize safety systems on their own. But what must be done, by whom, and how success is recognized early enough to prevent drift. At the central level, leadership must treat brake pads as a regulated safety supply, not a symbolic manufacturing win. Under Ibrahim Traoré, that means setting non-negotiable rules before volume expands. Clear standards must define acceptable performance bands, mandatory batch identification, and routine testing schedules. Success here is not measured by output alone, but by how quickly questionable lots can be traced and withdrawn without debate. At the level of producers and distributors, responsibility shifts to execution. Factories must slow collection when inputs do not meet specification, even when demand rises. Authorized distributors must commit to selling only verified batches and keeping them separated from informal stock. Compliance should be rewarded with stable pricing and supply priority, not speed in the first months. At the community level, the role is smaller but decisive. Mechanics enforce the final rule without explanation or exception. No batch identification, no installation. Riders reinforce that rule by choosing verification over price when the choice is visible. Fewer returns, earlier replacements, and declining complaints rather than public statements. If extended further, regional coordination and public communication support the system, but they cannot replace it. Education clarifies why rules exist. Each step reduces ambiguity. The closing truth is simple: discipline, not ambition, determines outcomes. When every layer knows its role and the system responds visibly under stress, confidence grows naturally. Doubt fills the gap immediately. The story circles back to the moment when judgment first became unavoidable, when a mechanic weighed a part in hand and decided whether to trust it. Quiet decisions made far from microphones and speeches. From the first announcement to the tightening of standards, the path has not been straight. Doubt, pressure, and correction. What looked like a simple idea expanded into a test of whether discipline could keep pace with ambition. Along the way, it became clear that systems do not earn trust by promising improvement, but by behaving the same way every day, especially when no one is watching. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the project has carried more than economic meaning. It has carried expectation. That expectation magnified both progress and risk, turning technical choices into signals read by the public. Each consistent batch strengthened confidence. Each unanswered question weakened it. The balance never rested on perfection, only on predictability. What remains is not a finished verdict, but a lesson with wider reach. Livelihoods and credibility intersect. Shortcuts do not stay hidden, and they define outcomes faster than intention ever could. Conversely, when rules are boring, visible, and enforced without exception, trust stops being fragile. This is no longer just a story about brake pads or recycling. It is about how societies decide what they can rely on, and how quickly that reliance disappears when certainty wavers. The final truth is simple and difficult at the same time. Once trust is earned in a safety system, it becomes a quiet asset. Once it is lost, no slogan can replace it. As this story comes to a close, it is worth slowing down rather than rushing to a conclusion. Different listeners will take different meanings from it, and that is not a weakness. It is a sign that the issue touches more than one layer of reality. If this analysis helped clarify how trust is built or broken in safety-critical systems, it may also help others who are still seeing only the surface narrative. Sharing understanding is not about persuasion, but about giving people better tools to think with, especially when headlines simplify what is actually complex. This conversation does not end with agreement or disagreement. It opens space for reflection. What matters is not whether one supports or doubts a specific project, but whether the standards used to judge it are serious enough for what is at stake. So the question is left open intentionally. When safety, livelihoods, and public trust intersect, what should matter most: speed, symbolism, or discipline? And how quickly should systems be slowed down when the signals begin to blur? Wherever you stand, engaging with that question keeps the discussion grounded in responsibility rather than reaction.